Hi, friends. I've enjoyed thinking about care with you all in your last posts, as well as about power and resistance and about Lou Reed and what a perfect day is like. I want to pick up from something that Rachel said in her post. She described her reading of the Lou Reed song as a generous reading. So I want to think about generosity today. In the week or so after I posted my video, I happen to have multiple introductions to the life and the work of a Dr. Paul Farmer. He came up in a discussion at the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology at the University of Texas at Dallas. It's a center I run. We had a guest speaker, Scott Podolsky, and he talked a little bit about Paul Farmer. I also saw a John Green Vlogbrothers post where he talked about Farmer, Dr. Farmer. For those of you who, like me, are unfamiliar, Paul Farmer was a physician and a medical anthropologist. He was the co-founder of the nonprofit Partners in Health, which does a lot of work around the world, improving health infrastructure in different communities. Dr. Farmer was a human rights advocate, also someone who was a kind of proponent of liberation theology, very interested in liberation theology. Interesting person. There's been a lot written about him, and you might be interested to check it out. But Farmer had a concept he called the hermeneutics of generosity that I think is interesting. So, we talked previously about the hermeneutics of suspicion, which goes under other names like resistant reading and paranoid reading and so on. And the idea of a hermeneutics of suspicion is that essentially everyone has kind of hidden motives or unconscious motives. Everyone has a kind of false consciousness. And so what people say and what they do has to be decoded in terms of the power dynamics behind them, or perhaps worse, the sort of venality or selfishness or kind of bad motives behind them. I think the best version gets more at power dynamics, but there's lots of ways of doing the hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of generosity, in the way I understand Farmer's idea, is it basically amounts to interpreting what someone says or someone does in the most positive and favorable light consistent with the evidence that you have, right? So basically, assume everybody means well, right? Almost everyone is trying their best. They see themselves as trying to do their best, right? In whatever way they think of that. I was really struck by this idea. It seemed close to what I was kind of groping for in my last video, but I'm also a little anxious about the idea, right? Is a hermeneutics of generosity kind of naive? Is it asking to be duped, right? I think it doesn't have to be. I think approaching things with a hermeneutics of generosity doesn't mean being naive. It doesn't mean letting ourselves be exploited by hidden motives and power dynamics. I mean, just because someone is doing their best doesn't mean that they're right or they're fully aware of what they're doing. And after all, good intentions are not always consistent with the evidence we have, right? So we can be generous and we can adopt a kind of default attitude of trusting without being total dupes, right? However, I think when we can adopt and deploy a hermeneutics of generosity, I mean, there's something transformative about that. John Green said that when he tries to adopt a hermeneutics of generosity, it helps him be more empathetic. I think that sort of sense of empathy and especially cooperation that I was sort of trying to get at last week is something that really could be encouraged by adopting this way of reading, particularly other people, right? What they say, what they do. Adolph Reed Jr. also visited my center last week, and sorry for continuing to talk about my center and all these people who've come. It's been very busy here, and so it's sort of what I'm thinking about. But Reed is an important thinker and a kind of public voice on issues of race and politics and class and politics. Reed's an activist, a labor organizer, long history there. Adolph is sort of known for his controversial criticisms of identity politics and anti-racist politics in favor of emphasizing a kind of politics focused on poor and working class people. There's lots of ways in which that's a less popular position today. But without getting into the weeds of those debates, it's complicated. I think what's motivating Reed to make those kinds of arguments is on the one hand a theory of change, right? A theory of change that requires solidarity and sort of big coalitions, right? I think also he wants to emphasize the kind of politics that benefits large majorities of people who are suffering similarly, right? And so emphasize, and this is just maybe another way of saying solidarity, but emphasizes the similarity of people's plight across large groups of people and sort of political changes that could benefit everyone despite the differences. I was struck, in my many interactions with Reed during his visit by his personal generosity. And I think we can read his politics as a politics of generosity. His worry about overemphasis on race, among other things, is that it kind of requires suspicion. It alienates. It often fails to consist of generous interpretation of the actions and words of others, right? If suspicion divides and generosity builds solidarity, and solidarity is what we need to build new things, then it kind of makes sense, right? And I think Reed does this actually does all this without ever losing sight of the fact that racism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, and other forms of both personal animus and structural violence are real. They're alive and well. They're a matter of concern. But, we can keep our eye on both of these things. I think there's so many issues today that would benefit from a politics of solidarity and cooperation. I mean, how we deal with pandemics, how we're going to deal with climate change, how we deal with widespread inequality. So many issues that really need widespread cooperation and solidarity. And I'm just thinking, can generosity, can a hermeneutics and politics of generosity help us build the sort of solidarity that we need to address these things? So there's a lot more I want to say about generosity. In a future video, maybe I'd like to talk about an ethics of generosity, more of a personal ethics of generosity, what that might mean. I'd like to talk about generosity in the context of leadership, maybe. Or I might find myself swept off by some other topic. But that's what I'm thinking about right now. In the meantime, friends, I hope you are well, and I hope you have a good week.